The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Riverside Community College as Sarah Martinez stepped out of her old Honda Civic. At 32, she looked like any other student returning to finish her degree. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a plain blue sweater. Nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary life she had lived before this moment. Sarah had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, leading combat missions that saved countless lives. Her chest bore decorations that few would ever earn: a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and commendations that spoke of courage under fire. But those medals now sat in a box in her small apartment, hidden away like the scars that covered parts of her body. The transition from military to civilian life had been harder than any mission she had ever faced. The nightmares came regularly, jolting her awake in cold sweats. Crowds made her nervous. Loud noises sent her reaching for weapons that were no longer there. The Department of Veterans Affairs had diagnosed her with PTSD and recommended therapy, but Sarah found it difficult to trust anyone who had never been in combat. Education had become her new mission. She wanted to become a counselor, specifically to help other veterans navigate the difficult path from war zone to everyday life. Riverside Community College offered a psychology program that would give her the foundation she needed before transferring to a 4-year university. It was a practical choice, and Sarah had always been practical above all else. As she walked toward the main building, Sarah noticed the usual mix of students. Most were young, fresh out of high school, carrying backpacks covered in patches and stickers. Some were older, like herself, returning to school after life had taken them in different directions. She had learned to blend in during her first semester, keeping her head down and avoiding attention. The last thing she wanted was questions about her background. Professor Williams had already started the morning lecture when Sarah slipped into her American history class. She took her usual seat in the back corner, a position that allowed her to see the entire room while keeping her back to a solid wall. Old habits died hard, and situational awareness had kept her alive in places where a moment of carelessness meant death. As we discussed last week, Professor Williams was saying, the Vietnam War created significant social upheaval in American society. The anti-war movement challenged not just government policy, but traditional notions of patriotism and military service. A young man named Derek, who sat in the front row, raised his hand. Professor, don't you think the military just brainwashes people into being killers? I mean, how else do you explain the things that happened over there? Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Derek was a frequent contributor to class discussions, and his comments often revealed a deep distrust of anything related to the military. She had listened to his opinions for weeks without responding, but something about his casual dismissal of service members struck a nerve. Professor Williams nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective, Derek. The psychological impact of military training is certainly worth examining. The process of basic training does fundamentally change how individuals think and react. Whether we call that brainwashing or conditioning might depend on our own viewpoint. It's definitely brainwashing, Derek continued, gaining confidence. They take young people and turn them into mindless robots who follow orders without question. Look at all the atrocities that have been committed by American soldiers. My Lai, Abu Ghraib, drone strikes that kill innocent civilians. These people lose their humanity. Other students began to join the conversation. A young woman named Jessica spoke up from the middle of the room. But don't soldiers also do good things? I mean, they help during disasters and protect people. Derek shook his head dismissively. That's just propaganda. The military exists to kill people and break things. Everything else is just public relations to make people feel better about funding it. Sarah found herself gripping her pen so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She forced herself to breathe slowly, using techniques she had learned in therapy. Getting angry would not help anyone, and it would only draw the kind of attention she preferred to avoid. The reality is probably more complex than either extreme, Professor Williams said diplomatically. Military service involves individuals making difficult moral choices in extreme circumstances. History shows us examples of both great heroism and terrible failures within military organizations. Heroism. Derek laughed. Come on, Professor. These people volunteer to go kill strangers in foreign countries for money. There's nothing heroic about that. It's legalized murder, and then we pretend they're heroes so we don't have to feel guilty about what we've asked them to do. The classroom fell silent. Several students looked uncomfortable with Derek's harsh words, while others nodded in agreement. Sarah could feel her heart rate increasing, a familiar response to stress that she had learned to recognize and control. You might want to consider, Professor Williams said carefully, that many veterans struggle with exactly those moral questions when they return home. The psychological cost of military service is often quite high, particularly for those who have seen combat. Good, Derek said without hesitation. Maybe if more of them came home messed up, fewer people would be willing to go in the first place. The whole system depends on people being stupid enough to believe they're fighting for freedom when they're really just protecting corporate interests. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She realized she had reached a breaking point, but she also knew she had to choose her words carefully. Derek, she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that made several students sit up straighter. I think you might be oversimplifying a complex issue. Derek turned to face her, clearly pleased to have found someone willing to argue with him. Oh, really? And what makes you an expert on military policy? Sarah walked slowly down the aisle between the desks, her movements fluid and controlled. Years of combat training had given her a way of moving that commanded attention without seeming threatening. I'm not an expert on military policy, she said, stopping about 10 feet from Derek's desk. But I am someone who spent 8 years serving my country, including 5 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The classroom became completely silent. Professor Williams looked surprised, clearly unaware of Sarah's background despite having her in class for several months. Derek's eyes narrowed. So you're one of them. That explains why you're so defensive. I'm not being defensive, Sarah replied. I'm trying to help you understand that the people you're talking about are real human beings with real families and real reasons for their choices. Dismissing them as brainwashed killers doesn't serve any useful purpose. But that's exactly what you are, Derek said, his voice rising. You went to other countries and killed people who never threatened America. You followed orders without thinking about whether they were right or wrong. That's the definition of a brainwashed killer. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. She had faced enemy fire, improvised explosive devices, and life-or-death decisions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. But, somehow, this classroom confrontation felt different. More personal, more threatening to the new life she was trying to build. You don't know anything about the decisions I made or the reasons I made them, she said quietly. You don't know about the schools we built, the medical supplies we delivered, or the children we protected from people who would have killed them for going to school. Propaganda, Derek shot back. Classic military propaganda designed to make you feel better about the killing. You don't know about the night my unit spent defending a village from Taliban fighters who wanted to execute every adult male because they had cooperated with coalition forces, Sarah continued, her voice growing harder. You don't know about the little girl who bled out in my arms because those same fighters had thrown a grenade into a school. The room was completely silent now. Even Derek seemed to realize that the conversation had moved beyond academic debate into something much more personal and painful. You don't know about the interpreter who worked with us for 2 years, helping us communicate with local leaders and save American lives, who was murdered along with his entire family because someone identified him as a collaborator, Sarah said, her eyes never leaving Derek's face. You don't know about waking up every night for 3 years because you keep seeing the faces of the people you couldn't save. Professor Williams cleared his throat softly. Perhaps we should take a step back and— No, Sarah said, still looking at Derek. He wants to talk about brainwashed killers. Let's talk about it. You think military training removes someone's humanity. I think it reveals it. When you're in a situation where people are shooting at you and your friends, when innocent civilians are caught in the middle, when you have to make life-or-death decisions in seconds, that's when you find out who you really are. Derek's face had gone pale, but he wasn't backing down. You're just proving my point. You've been conditioned to see violence as the solution to problems. You can't even have a classroom discussion without trying to intimidate people. Sarah took a deep breath, recognizing the truth in his words. She was letting her emotions control her behavior, something she had worked hard to avoid since coming home. "You're right," she said, surprising everyone in the room. "I am more comfortable with confrontation than most people. Military training does change how you think and react, but it doesn't remove your ability to make moral choices. If anything, it forces you to confront moral questions that most people never have to face." She walked back toward her seat, then turned to address the class as a whole. "The young man Derek is talking about, the one who was supposedly brainwashed into being a killer? That was me. I joined the military when I was 19 because I wanted to serve my country and because I needed money for college. The training was hard, harder than anything I had ever experienced. It broke me down and built me back up into someone who could function under extreme stress." She paused, looking around the room at the faces watching her intently. "But it didn't make me a mindless robot. Every mission, every engagement, every time I had to use my weapon, it was a choice. Sometimes it was an easy choice, like when we were protecting civilians. Sometimes it was harder, like when we had intelligence about enemy fighters, but weren't sure how reliable that information was. And sometimes it was impossible, like when following orders would have meant letting innocent people die." Derek found his voice again. "So you admit you killed people?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "I killed people who were trying to kill me and my teammates and innocent civilians. I also saved people who would have died if I hadn't been there. I built relationships with local leaders who helped bring stability to their communities. I trained local security forces to protect their own people. Military service is complicated, Derek. It's not a video game or a movie where the good guys and bad guys are clearly labeled." Professor Williams stepped forward. "This has been a very enlightening discussion, but perhaps we should return to our scheduled material for today." Sarah nodded and started walking back to her seat. But Derek wasn't finished. "You can dress it up however you want," he called after her. "But at the end of the day, you're a trained killer who got paid to go to other countries and use violence to force people to do what America wanted them to do. That's not service. That's mercenary work." Sarah stopped walking. She stood perfectly still for several seconds, and something in her posture made the entire room hold its breath. When she turned around, her face was completely calm, but her eyes held something that made Derek lean back in his chair. "Derek," she said in a voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear her, "I understand that you have strong feelings about military policy. That's your right, and it's important for citizens to question their government's actions. But you're making this personal in a way that's not productive." She took a step closer to his desk. "You don't know me. You don't know the sacrifices I've made or the prices I've paid. You don't know about the friends I've lost or the promises I've made to families who will never see their loved ones again. And you certainly don't have the right to tell me what my service meant or whether it was worthwhile." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but something in Sarah's expression made him close it again. "What you do have the right to do," Sarah continued, "is challenge ideas and policies in a respectful way that acknowledges the humanity of everyone involved. What you don't have the right to do is attack people personally because you disagree with choices they made before you ever met them." The classroom remained completely silent. Professor Williams looked like he wanted to intervene, but wasn't sure how. "I came back to school because I want to help other veterans deal with the challenges of civilian life," Sarah said, addressing the entire class now. "Many of them struggle with exactly the questions Derek is raising. They wonder whether their service meant anything. They question the decisions they made. They carry guilt and anger and confusion about their experiences." She looked directly at Derek again. "What they don't need is to be told by someone who has never faced those challenges that they're stupid or evil or brainwashed. What they need is understanding, support, and recognition that they're human beings who did their best in difficult circumstances." Sarah walked back to her seat and sat down. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Finally, Professor Williams cleared his throat. "Well, I think we've all learned something important today about the complexity of these issues and the importance of treating each other with respect, even when we disagree strongly." Derek raised his hand again. "Professor, I want to make something clear. I wasn't attacking Sarah personally. I was critiquing a system that I believe is fundamentally wrong. Sarah looked at him steadily. Derek, when you called me a brainwashed killer and a mercenary, that felt pretty personal. I was making a general point about military personnel, Derek insisted. It wasn't specifically about you. But I am military personnel, Sarah replied. So when you make sweeping statements about all military personnel, you are talking about me specifically. A young woman named Maria, who had been silent throughout the discussion, raised her hand tentatively. I have a question for both of you, if that's okay. Professor Williams nodded. Go ahead, Maria. Sarah, you said military training doesn't remove someone's ability to make moral choices. But Derek has a point about following orders. What happens when you get an order that you think is wrong? Sarah considered the question carefully. That's probably the hardest part of military service, Maria. You take an oath to follow lawful orders from those appointed over you. But you also take an oath to defend the Constitution, which includes moral and legal principles that sometimes conflict with specific orders. Can you give an example? Maria asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about how much she wanted to reveal. There was a night in Afghanistan when we received intelligence about a compound that supposedly housed enemy fighters. The intelligence was thin, and I had concerns about civilian casualties. My commanding officer wanted to call in an airstrike. The class was listening intently. I argued against it. I said we should conduct ground reconnaissance first to confirm the target and identify any civilians in the area. My CO said we didn't have time, that the intelligence was good enough, and that we needed to act immediately. What did you do? Maria asked. I continued to argue against the airstrike. I presented alternative plans. I made my concerns clear through the chain of command. Eventually, I convinced my CO to authorize a reconnaissance mission first. And what happened? Sarah's expression grew grim. We found 3 families hiding in the compound, including 6 children. They had been displaced by fighting in their village and were using the abandoned building for shelter. If we had called in that airstrike, we would have killed 18 innocent people. The classroom was completely silent. But what if your commanding officer had insisted on the airstrike anyway? Derek asked, his tone much less confrontational than before. Then, I would have had to make a choice, Sarah said simply. Follow an order that I believed would result in the deaths of innocent people, or refuse a direct order and face court-martial. What choice would you have made? Derek pressed. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. I would have refused the order. Some things are more important than military discipline. Professor Williams stepped forward again. This is exactly the kind of moral complexity that we should be examining when we discuss military policy and individual responsibility. Derek raised his hand again. Okay, so maybe I was wrong about military personnel being unable to make moral choices. But what about the bigger picture? What about fighting wars that shouldn't be fought in the first place? Sarah nodded. That's a valid question, Derek. And it's one that a lot of veterans struggle with. When you're on the ground, your focus is on completing the mission and protecting your teammates. You don't usually have access to the political and strategic information that drives policy decisions. So you just follow orders without questioning the overall strategy? Derek asked. Not exactly, Sarah replied. You question tactics and specific operations. You advocate for approaches that you think will be more effective or cause fewer casualties. But you generally don't have enough information to evaluate grand strategy. Doesn't that bother you? Derek asked, not knowing whether the overall mission is justified. Sarah was quiet for a moment. It bothers me a lot, actually. It's one of the reasons I came back to school. I want to understand policy and strategy better so I can contribute to those discussions as a civilian. But doesn't that prove my point? Derek pressed. If you can't evaluate whether a war is justified, how can you participate in fighting it? Because somebody has to, Sarah said simply. Right or wrong, when political leaders decide to use military force, somebody has to execute that decision. And I'd rather it be people who care about doing it as ethically and effectively as possible than people who don't. Derek shook his head. But if good people refuse to participate in unjust wars, maybe we'd have fewer unjust wars. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged. But we'd also be less prepared to fight just wars. And we'd be turning military service over to people who might not share our values about protecting civilians and following international law. The discussion continued for the rest of the class period, with other students gradually joining in. The tone remained respectful, even when people disagreed strongly. As the class ended and students began gathering their belongings, Derek approached Sarah's desk. "I want to apologize," he said awkwardly. "I shouldn't have called you a brainwashed killer. That was out of line." Sarah looked up at him. "I appreciate that, Derek. And I apologize for being so confrontational. I'm still working on managing my reactions to certain topics. Can I ask you something?" Derek said. "Sure. Do you ever regret joining the military?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "That's complicated. I regret some of the things I had to do. I regret some of the things I couldn't prevent. I regret the friends I lost, and the families that were torn apart. But I don't regret trying to serve something bigger than myself. Even knowing what you know now. Even knowing what I know now," Sarah confirmed. "But I understand why you disagree with that choice." Derek nodded slowly. "I still think the military-industrial complex is a problem. I still think we fight too many wars for the wrong reasons. But I guess I didn't really think about the individual people who get caught up in those policies." "The system is definitely worth questioning," Sarah agreed. "Just try to remember that the people in the system are human beings who are usually trying to do the right thing, even when they're working within a flawed framework." As Derek left the classroom, Sarah began packing her own books. She felt emotionally drained, but also oddly relieved. For months, she had been hiding her background, trying to blend in and avoid difficult conversations. Today had been uncomfortable, but it had also been honest in a way that felt like a step forward. Professor Williams approached her desk as she finished packing. "Sarah, I had no idea about your military background. Thank you for sharing your perspective with the class." "I hope it was helpful," Sarah said. "I know it got pretty intense." "These are important conversations to have," Professor Williams said. "And they're more meaningful when we can hear from people who have actually lived through these experiences." 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in Professor Williams' American history class. Sarah had noticed a change in how other students interacted with her. Some approached her with curiosity, asking respectful questions about military service. Others seemed intimidated and kept their distance. A few, like Derek, had begun treating her with a newfound respect that felt genuine rather than forced. Sarah was sitting in the campus coffee shop, reviewing notes for her upcoming psychology midterm, when she overheard a conversation at the next table that made her blood run cold. "The problem is that these veteran students think they can just waltz in here and take over," a voice was saying. "They get special treatment, special programs, preferential treatment for admission, and financial aid. It's not fair to traditional students." Sarah looked up from her textbook to see 3 students she recognized from various classes. The speaker was Brad Peterson, a loud and opinionated sophomore who seemed to have strong feelings about everything. The other 2 were nodding along with his complaints. "And they're so aggressive," added Lisa, a junior who was president of the campus environmental club. That woman in Professor Williams' class was completely out of line. She practically threatened that poor kid just for expressing his opinion. "Exactly," Brad continued. "These people are trained killers. They don't belong in an academic environment where we're supposed to solve problems through discussion and debate, not intimidation and violence." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She forced herself to breathe slowly and tried to focus on her textbook, but the conversation continued. "I heard she was a Navy SEAL," said the 3rd student, whose name Sarah didn't know. "Can you imagine? A woman who was trained to assassinate people is sitting in our classrooms. It makes me uncomfortable." "It should make you uncomfortable," Brad said. "These people have been conditioned to see violence as the solution to everything. They can't adapt to civilian life because they've been programmed to be weapons." Sarah closed her textbook and stood up. She had heard enough. But as she gathered her belongings, Brad's voice carried across the coffee shop. "I mean, what's next? Are we going to let ex-cons attend classes with regular students? Are we going to give scholarships to drug dealers who claim they've reformed? Where do we draw the line?" Other students in the coffee shop were starting to look uncomfortable. Some were openly staring at Brad's table, while others were trying to pretend they couldn't hear the conversation. Sarah walked directly to Brad's table and stood beside it, her presence causing all 3 students to look up nervously. "Brad," she said calmly, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I think there might be some misunderstandings about veteran students that we should clear up." Brad's face flushed red, but He tried to maintain his aggressive posture. I wasn't talking about you specifically, he said defensively. Yes, you were, Sarah replied. You were talking about that woman in Professor Williams' class who was supposedly out of line for threatening someone. That was me. Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. We were just discussing the challenges of integrating different types of students into the academic environment. No, Sarah said, pulling up an empty chair and sitting down without being invited. You were discussing whether veterans belong in college at all. And you were doing it in a way that suggests you think we're dangerous and unstable. The coffee shop had grown quieter as other students began paying attention to the conversation. Look, Brad said, trying to sound reasonable. I'm sure you're a nice person. But you have to admit that military training changes people in ways that might not be compatible with academic discourse. Sarah studied his face for a moment. Brad, what's your major? Business administration, he answered, looking confused by the question. And what do you plan to do after graduation? I'm going to work in corporate management, probably in finance or consulting. Sarah nodded. So you're being trained to compete aggressively in the business world, to make decisions that prioritize profit over other considerations, and to manage people in ways that maximize productivity regardless of personal cost. That's not exactly how I describe it, Brad said defensively. But it's accurate, isn't it? Sarah continued. Business school teaches you to think strategically, to identify weaknesses in competitors, and to exploit opportunities even when it means other people lose. Business isn't about hurting people, Brad protested. Neither is military service, Sarah replied. But both involve training people to think and act in ways that prioritize certain goals over others. The difference is that I was trained to protect people, while you're being trained to profit from them. Lisa leaned forward. That's not a fair comparison. Business competition doesn't involve killing people. You're right, Sarah acknowledged. Business competition involves economic decisions that can destroy communities, eliminate jobs, and force families into poverty. Military action, when it's justified, involves protecting those communities and families from people who want to harm them. The third student, who had been silent until now, spoke up. But you said yourself that you've killed people. How do you justify that? The same way a doctor justifies cutting into someone's body during surgery, Sarah answered. Sometimes causing immediate harm is necessary to prevent greater harm. That's completely different, Brad scoffed. Is it? Sarah asked. Both involve highly trained professionals making life and death decisions based on their expertise and judgment. Both involve accepting responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. Both require years of training to develop the skills and ethical framework necessary to act responsibly. A small crowd had gathered around their table, other students drawn by the intensity of the conversation. Sarah noticed several faces she recognized, including Derek from her history class. The point is, Sarah continued, that every profession shapes how people think and behave. Military service is no different in that regard. What is different is that military service explicitly includes ethical training about when and how force can be used. But you're still trained killers, Lisa insisted. Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Just like police officers are trained to use force when necessary. Just like doctors are trained to make decisions that determine whether people live or die. Just like business executives are trained to make decisions that affect thousands of people's livelihoods. She looked around the table at each of them. The question isn't whether someone has been trained to use power that affects other people's lives. The question is whether they've been trained to use that power responsibly and ethically. Brad crossed his arms. And you think killing people in foreign countries is ethical? I think protecting innocent people from those who would harm them is ethical, Sarah replied. Sometimes that requires using force against people who are using force against innocents. But how do you know you're protecting innocent people? Derek asked, joining the conversation as he approached the table. How do you know you're not just advancing American economic interests? Sarah looked at Derek with surprise and some respect. His question was challenging but thoughtful, unlike Brad's accusations. That's the hardest question any service member faces, she said honestly. At the tactical level, you can usually tell when you're protecting innocent people. When someone is shooting at a school or a hospital, the moral calculus is pretty clear. She paused, considering her words carefully. At the strategic level, it's much more complicated. That's why it's important for citizens to hold their government accountable for military decisions. But once those decisions are made, somebody has to execute them. And I'd rather it be people who care about minimizing harm and protecting civilians than people who don't. But don't you see how that perpetuates the system? Lisa asked. If good people refuse to participate in unjust wars, maybe we'd stop fighting them. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged. But we'd also be unprepared to fight just wars. And we'd be turning military service over to people who might not share our values about protecting innocent life. A new voice joined the conversation from the crowd of students. Can I ask a different question? Sarah looked up to see Maria, the student who had asked thoughtful questions in history class. Of course. How do you deal with the emotional cost of what you've experienced? I mean, regardless of whether military action is right or wrong, it must be traumatic to go through combat. Sarah's expression softened. That's probably the most important question anyone's asked me since I started school here, Maria. And it's the reason I'm studying psychology. She looked around at the faces watching her intently. Combat is traumatic, even when it's justified. Taking a life changes you, even when it's necessary to save other lives. Seeing friends die affects you permanently, even when their sacrifice accomplishes something important. The coffee shop had become completely quiet except for Sarah's voice. Most veterans struggle with those experiences when they come home. We question our decisions. We replay scenarios in our minds. We wonder if there was something we could have done differently. We have nightmares, anxiety attacks, depression, relationship problems. So why do it? Brad asked, his tone less confrontational than before. Because someone has to, Sarah said simply. Because there are people in the world who use violence to oppress others, and sometimes the only way to stop them is with force. Because there are situations where talking and negotiating don't work, where diplomatic solutions aren't possible. She stood up and looked around at the crowd of students. I've seen what happens when evil people have power and good people do nothing to stop them. I've seen villages where every adult male was executed because they sent their daughters to school. I've seen hospitals bombed because they treated people regardless of their religion or ethnicity. I've seen children recruited as soldiers and used as human shields. The coffee shop remained silent. Those things don't stop because we disapprove of them. They don't stop because we protest against them. They stop when people with the training and equipment to use force effectively decide to intervene. But what about peaceful solutions? Lisa asked. What about diplomacy and economic pressure? Those things work sometimes, Sarah agreed. And they should always be tried first. But they don't work against people who are willing to use mass violence to achieve their goals. Derek raised his hand slightly. Can I ask about something specific? You mentioned seeing villages where men were executed for sending daughters to school. What was your unit's response to that? Sarah looked at him steadily. We worked with local leaders to establish security around schools. We trained local security forces to protect their own communities. We helped evacuate families who were under direct threat. Did you fight the people who were doing the executions? When we found them, yes. When they attacked us or the people we were protecting, yes. When we had solid intelligence about their locations and could engage them without endangering civilians, yes. And how do you feel about that now? Derek pressed. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I feel good about the schools that stayed open. I feel good about the girls who got to continue their education. I feel good about the families we were able to protect. But how do you feel about the people you killed? I feel sad that they made choices that led to violence, Sarah said. I feel sad that they couldn't be stopped through peaceful means. But I don't feel guilty about protecting innocent people from those who wanted to harm them. Brad leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. I still don't understand how you can be so calm about having killed people. Sarah sat back down. Brad, I'm not calm about it. I have nightmares about it. I go to therapy to deal with it. I take medication to manage anxiety and depression related to it. It affects every relationship I try to have and every decision I make about my future. Her voice grew quieter. But feeling terrible about it doesn't change the fact that it was necessary. Feeling guilty doesn't bring back the people who died. But it also doesn't bring back the people who would have died if I hadn't acted. So how do you live with it? Maria asked softly. By trying to honor the sacrifice that others made, Sarah replied. By working to become someone who can help other veterans deal with similar struggles. by using my experience to contribute something positive to society. She looked around at the students surrounding the table. That's why I'm here, studying psychology. I want to understand trauma and recovery better so I can help other veterans transition back to civilian life. I want to contribute to research that might help us treat PTSD more effectively. I want to be part of the solution to the problems that military service creates. Lisa looked confused. But if military service creates so many problems, why not just oppose military action altogether? Because the problems created by military service pale in comparison to the problems created by failing to stop people who use violence against innocents, Sarah explained. Yes, veterans struggle with trauma and readjustment. But that's a manageable problem compared to genocide, mass rape, religious persecution, and systematic oppression. I never thought about it that way, the third student said quietly. Sarah turned to him. What's your name? I don't think we've met. Tom, he said nervously. I'm a sociology major. Tom, what do you plan to do with your sociology degree? I want to work with underserved communities, maybe in social work or community organizing. Sarah nodded. That's important work. You'll be helping people who have been marginalized or oppressed by social and economic systems. You'll be advocating for justice and trying to create positive change. Yeah, that's the goal. So you understand that sometimes good people have to take action against systems and individuals who are harming others. Tom considered this. I guess so. But I'd be using legal and peaceful methods. Absolutely, Sarah agreed. And that's the right approach for the problems you'll be addressing. But what happens when the people causing harm don't respond to legal and peaceful methods? What happens when they're willing to use violence to maintain their power? Tom was quiet for a moment. I don't know. That's when people like me get called in, Sarah said gently. When the peaceful solutions you believe in, and that I believe in too, aren't enough to protect the people who need protection. Derek spoke up again. Okay, I think I understand your perspective better now. But I still have concerns about the overall system. How do we make sure that military force is only used when it's really necessary? Sarah smiled for the first time during the conversation. That's exactly the right question to be asking, Derek. And it's exactly why people like you need to stay engaged with these issues. What do you mean? I mean that military personnel can't make those decisions alone. We can advocate for particular tactics and strategies based on our experience, but civilians have to make the big decisions about when and where military force is appropriate. She looked around at the group. That's why these conversations are so important. Democracy only works when citizens are informed about complex issues and willing to engage with difficult questions. Your skepticism about military action is valuable, Derek. Brad's concerns about the cost of military spending are important. Lisa's advocacy for peaceful solutions is necessary. But you think we need military force too, Brad said. I think we need the capability to use military force when other methods fail, Sarah clarified. And I think we need citizens who are informed enough to make good decisions about when that's necessary. Maria raised her hand again. Can I ask about your transition to civilian life? What's been the hardest part? Sarah's expression grew more serious. The hardest part is feeling like you don't fit anywhere. In the military, you have a clear mission, clear rules, clear expectations. Everyone around you shares certain values and experiences. When you come back to civilian life, everything is ambiguous. How do you mean? Maria asked. In the military, if someone needs help, you help them. No questions asked. In civilian life, people argue about whether someone deserves help. In the military, if there's a problem, you fix it or find someone who can. In civilian life, people complain about problems, but often don't want to do the work to solve them. Sarah paused, thinking about how to explain something that was difficult to put into words. In the military, your worth is determined by your competence and your commitment to the mission and your teammates. In civilian life, your worth seems to be determined by your education, your social status, your political opinions, your family background. Things that have nothing to do with your character or your ability to contribute. Is that why you went back to school? Tom asked. Partly, Sarah acknowledged. I realized that if I wanted to contribute to civilian society, I needed to understand how it works. I needed credentials that civilians respect. I needed to learn how to communicate with people who don't share my background and experiences. Has it been worth it? Derek asked, Sarah looked around at the group of students who had been challenging her, questioning her, and ultimately trying to understand her perspective. Ask me again in a few years, she said. But, so far, conversations like this one give me hope. Brad leaned forward. Can I ask you something personal? Sure. Do you ever wish you hadn't joined the military? Sarah considered the question carefully. I wish some things had been different. I wish I hadn't lost friends. I wish I hadn't seen some of the things I saw. I wish the transition back to civilian life had been easier. But, do you regret the decision itself? No, Sarah said firmly. I don't regret trying to serve something bigger than myself. I don't regret developing skills that allowed me to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I don't regret being part of something that, despite its flaws, generally tries to do the right thing. Even knowing what you know now about the costs. Derek asked. Even knowing what I know now, Sarah confirmed. But, I understand why other people make different choices. Military service isn't right for everyone, and it shouldn't be. Lisa spoke up. What would you say to students who are considering joining the military? I'd say make sure you understand what you're signing up for, Sarah replied. Make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Don't join because you think it will be exciting or glamorous. Don't join because you can't think of anything else to do with your life. What are the right reasons? Tom asked. A genuine desire to serve your country and protect others. A willingness to sacrifice personal comfort and safety for something you believe in. The ability to function as part of a team where everyone's life depends on everyone else doing their job correctly. She looked around the group. And make sure you're prepared for the fact that it will change you permanently. You'll see things and do things that will affect you for the rest of your life. You'll develop skills and perspectives that will set you apart from people who haven't had similar experiences. Do you think that's necessarily bad? Maria asked. Not necessarily, Sarah said. But it's something to be aware of. The gap between military and civilian culture is real, and it can be challenging to navigate. The conversation continued for another hour, with students asking questions about everything from military training to veteran benefits to foreign policy. Sarah answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging when she didn't know something or when her perspective might be limited. As the coffee shop began to empty out for evening classes, the group finally started to disperse. Sarah, Derek said as he gathered his books. Thank you for taking the time to explain all this. I still have concerns about military policy, but I have a better understanding of the people who serve. That's all I can ask for, Sarah replied. Brad approached her as she was packing her own belongings. I owe you an apology, he said awkwardly. I made assumptions about veterans that weren't fair. We all make assumptions based on limited information, Sarah said. The important thing is being willing to change those assumptions when we learn more. Can I ask you one more question? Brad said. Of course. What would you want civilians to understand about veterans? Sarah thought for a moment. That we're not all the same. Some of us struggled in the military and struggle as civilians. Some of us thrived in the military but have trouble adjusting to civilian life. Some of us had positive experiences and some had traumatic experiences, and sometimes the same person had both. What else? That we're not heroes or villains. We're people who made a particular choice about how to serve our country, and we're dealing with the consequences of that choice just like everyone else deals with the consequences of their choices. And that we want the same things most people want. Good jobs, stable relationships, safe communities, opportunities for our children. We just might have different ideas about how to achieve those things based on our experiences. The threats began 2 days after the coffee shop conversation. Sarah found the first note tucked under her windshield wiper when she returned to her car after evening psychology class. The message was simple and typed. Baby killer. You don't belong here. Leave before something bad happens. Sarah stood in the parking lot, reading the note under the yellow glow of a street light. Her military training kicked in immediately. She scanned the area for anyone watching her, checked for signs that her car had been tampered with, and made mental notes about the timing and location of the incident. The note itself told her several things. Someone had been watching her long enough to know her schedule and which car she drove. They had access to the campus after dark. They were escalating from verbal confrontation to direct intimidation. And they were either too smart to handwrite the note or too cowardly to risk their handwriting being identified. Sarah folded the note and put it in her backpack. She drove home carefully, taking a route that would allow her to spot anyone following her. Once in her apartment, she photographed the note and wrote down everything she remembered about finding it. If this escalated further, she wanted documentation. The second incident happened 3 days later. Sarah was sitting in the campus library, working on a research paper about cognitive behavioral therapy for combat veterans, when someone sat down across from her at the study table. She looked up to see a young man she didn't recognize, probably in his early 20s, with bleached hair and multiple piercings. "You're Sarah Martinez," he said quietly. "Do I know you?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. "No, but I know you. You're the Navy SEAL who thinks she's better than everyone else." Sarah closed her laptop and gave the young man her full attention. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. What's your name?" "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that people are talking about you." "What people?" Sarah asked. The young man leaned forward. "People who think this campus would be better off without military killers walking around intimidating other students." Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest, the same feeling she used to get before combat operations. But she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not sure what you think I've done to intimidate anyone," she said quietly. "But if you have specific concerns, maybe we should discuss them with a counselor or administrator." "The only thing we want to discuss with you is when you're going to leave," the young man said, standing up. "This is a place of learning and peace. We don't want your kind of violence here." He walked away before Sarah could respond, leaving her sitting alone at the table with other students staring at her curiously. Sarah reopened her laptop and tried to focus on her research, but her mind was racing. The confrontation felt different from the previous discussions with Derek and Brad. Those had been genuine attempts to understand different perspectives. This felt like something more organized, more deliberate. The young man had known her name and had clearly been sent to deliver a message. That evening, Sarah called the number for campus security and asked to speak with someone about a potential harassment issue. She was transferred to Officer Janet Coleman, a middle-aged woman who sounded both professional and sympathetic. "Can you tell me what's been happening, Ms. Martinez?" Officer Coleman asked. Sarah described both incidents in detail, reading directly from her notes. She also mentioned the coffee shop conversation and the classroom discussions that might have prompted the escalation. "Have you had any other interactions with students who seemed hostile toward your military background?" Officer Coleman asked. "There have been some heated discussions in classes," Sarah admitted. "But those felt like legitimate academic debate. These incidents feel more personal and more threatening." "I understand. We take harassment seriously here, especially when it involves potential safety concerns. Can you come in tomorrow morning to file a formal report?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Should I be concerned about my safety?" Officer Coleman was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, but I'd recommend basic precautions. Vary your routes around campus, be aware of your surroundings, and call us immediately if anything else happens." Sarah hung up the phone feeling frustrated. She had faced rocket attacks, sniper fire, and improvised explosive devices without flinching. But being harassed by college students on an American campus somehow felt more unsettling. In a combat zone, she knew who the enemies were and what they wanted. Here, the threats were ambiguous and the motivations unclear. The next morning, Sarah arrived on campus early for her appointment with Officer Coleman. The campus security office was located in the basement of the administration building, a cramped space that smelled like coffee and floor polish. Officer Coleman was a former police officer who had been working campus security for 8 years. She listened carefully as Sarah provided additional details about the incidents and filled out the required paperwork. "Ms. Martinez, I have to ask you some questions about your military service," Officer Coleman said. "I'm not questioning your account of these incidents, but I need to understand the full context. What would you like to know? Have you been involved in any incidents since starting school that might have drawn negative attention? Any confrontations, arguments, or situations where other students might have felt threatened?" Sarah described the classroom discussion with Derek and the coffee shop conversation with Brad's group. She tried to be objective about her own behavior, acknowledging when she might have come across as confrontational. "It sounds like you handled those situations appropriately," Officer Coleman said. "But it's possible that some students misinterpreted your responses as threatening." "How so?" Sarah asked. Well, you have a background in special operations. Some students might see that as inherently intimidating, regardless of your actual behavior. Add in some heated discussions about military policy, and it's possible that someone felt genuinely threatened even if that wasn't your intention. Sarah nodded. So what do you recommend? Continue to document any incidents. Avoid engaging with students who seem hostile. Refer them to me or to academic staff if they want to discuss their concerns. And consider talking to the counseling center about strategies for managing these situations. Do you think I'm in actual danger? Sarah asked directly. Officer Coleman considered the question carefully. The incidents you've described are concerning, but they haven't crossed the line into direct threats of violence. However, I want to keep a close eye on the situation. Sometimes these things escalate quickly. That afternoon, Sarah had her first appointment with Dr. Rebecca Santos at the campus counseling center. Dr. Santos was a psychologist who specialized in working with veteran students, and she had been recommended by Officer Coleman. Tell me about what brings you in today, Dr. Santos said after they had settled into chairs in her small office. Sarah described the recent incidents and her concerns about escalation. But she also found herself talking about the broader challenges of adjusting to civilian life and academic culture. It sounds like you've been dealing with a lot of stress lately, Dr. Santos observed. I've dealt with worse, Sarah said automatically. I'm sure you have. But that doesn't mean the current stress isn't significant. How are you sleeping? Not well, Sarah admitted. But that's been an issue since I got out of the military. Nightmares. Sometimes. Also just general anxiety. My mind races when I try to sleep. Dr. Santos made notes in her file. How about during the day? Are you having anxiety attacks, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Sometimes I'll be sitting in class, and suddenly, I'm thinking about Afghanistan. A car backfiring sounds like gunfire. Crowds make me nervous. Loud arguments make me want to find cover. Those are all normal responses for someone with your background, Dr. Santos said gently. PTSD affects everyone differently, and it can be triggered by new stressors even years after the original trauma. I know the clinical definition, Sarah said. I'm studying to be a counselor myself. But knowing about something intellectually and experiencing it personally are very different things, Dr. Santos pointed out. How do you think the recent harassment incidents are affecting your PTSD symptoms? Sarah considered the question. They're definitely making things worse. I'm more hypervigilant than usual. I'm having trouble concentrating in class. And I keep analyzing every interaction for potential threats. That makes sense. When someone with combat experience faces a new threat, even a relatively minor one, it can activate all the old survival instincts. So what do I do about it? Dr. Santos leaned forward. First, we need to address the immediate safety concerns. Are you taking the campus security recommendations seriously? Yes, but it feels ridiculous. I've survived actual combat. I shouldn't need to worry about college students. Sarah, one thing I've learned working with veterans is that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you don't expect to face. In combat, you knew who your enemies were and what they wanted. This situation is more ambiguous, which can actually make it more stressful. Over the next week, the harassment continued but evolved. Instead of direct confrontations, Sarah began noticing more subtle forms of intimidation. She would find her regular study spots occupied by groups of students who would stare at her until she left. Someone had written "murderer" in chalk on the sidewalk outside the building where her morning classes were held. Her car windshield was soaked with messages like "Go home, killer." Each incident by itself was minor, but the cumulative effect was wearing her down. Sarah found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, analyzing the motivations of every student who made eye contact, and planning escape routes from every room she entered. The situation came to a head on a Friday afternoon when Sarah was leaving her psychology research methods class. As she walked across the quad toward the parking lot, she became aware of a group of students following her. When she stopped to tie her shoe, they stopped. When she changed direction, they changed direction. Sarah made a quick decision. Instead of heading to her car, she walked toward the campus security office. The group continued following her for another 100 yards before breaking off and dispersing. Officer Coleman wasn't in her office, but another security officer took Sarah's report and called Coleman at home. 20 minutes later, Coleman arrived on campus looking grim. "This has gone too far," she said after reviewing Sarah's report. "Following someone around campus crosses the line into stalking behavior. I'm going to recommend to the dean of students that we open a formal investigation." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "It means we'll start interviewing students to find out who's behind this. We'll also increase security patrols in areas where you spend time. And we'll send a clear message that harassment of students based on their military service won't be tolerated." "Will that make things worse?" Sarah asked. "I don't want to be seen as someone who can't handle her own problems." Officer Coleman looked at her seriously. "Sarah, you're not creating these problems. You're responding to harassment that violates both campus policies and state laws. You have every right to attend classes without being intimidated." That weekend, Sarah spent most of her time in her apartment, trying to catch up on schoolwork and process what had been happening. But on Sunday afternoon, she received a phone call that changed everything. "Sarah, this is Derek from your history class." "Hi, Derek. How did you get my phone number?" "It's in the student directory." "Listen, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet somewhere private?" Sarah's military training made her suspicious of unexpected contact, but Derek's voice sounded genuinely concerned rather than threatening. "What about?" she asked. "About the harassment you've been experiencing. I think I know who's behind it, and I think you need to know what you're dealing with." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop off campus, away from the college environment where Sarah had been feeling increasingly unwelcome. Derek was already waiting when she arrived, looking nervous and uncomfortable. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down across from him. "I wasn't sure you'd trust me after our first few conversations." "What do you want to tell me?" Sarah asked directly. Derek looked around the nearly empty coffee shop before leaning forward and speaking quietly. "There's a group of students on campus that calls itself the Peace Coalition. They're opposed to what they call the militarization of higher education." "What does that mean?" "They think that allowing veterans to attend college with civilian students normalizes military culture and makes violence seem acceptable. They believe that people with military backgrounds shouldn't be allowed in academic settings." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "How many people are in this group?" "Maybe 15 or 20 active members, but they have support from some faculty and staff. They've been organizing against the Veterans Services Program for months." "And you think they're responsible for the harassment?" Derek nodded. "I know they are. I went to one of their meetings last week because I was curious about their positions. They were specifically discussing you and how to make you feel unwelcome enough to leave." Sarah sat back in her chair, processing this information. "Who leads this group?" "A graduate student named Marcus Webb. He's working on a PhD in peace studies, and he has very strong feelings about American military policy. There's also a professor named Dr. Helen Carson who advises them informally." "What exactly are they planning to do?" Derek looked uncomfortable. "They're planning to escalate. The harassment so far has been what they call educational actions designed to make you aware that you're unwelcome. But if you don't leave voluntarily, they're planning more aggressive measures. Such as, I don't know specifics, but Marcus was talking about making it impossible for you to attend classes or use campus facilities. He mentioned something about direct action if the educational approach doesn't work." Sarah felt the familiar coldness settling in her chest again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, relief. Finally, she had a clear picture of what she was dealing with. The uncertainty had been worse than the actual threat. "Derek, why are you telling me this? Why not just let me deal with it on my own?" Derek was quiet for a moment. "Because after our conversations, I realized that I don't agree with their methods, even if I might share some of their concerns about military policy. You have a right to be on campus. You have a right to pursue your education. And what they're doing is just bullying disguised as political action. Will you tell campus security what you've told me?" "Yes, if you think it would help. But I want you to know that this might get worse before it gets better. Marcus and his group are true believers. They think they're fighting for something important." Sarah nodded. "I've dealt with true believers before." "How?" Sarah looked at Derek steadily. "By being clearer about my own beliefs and more committed to my mission than they are to theirs." "What's your mission now?" "To get my degree, become a licensed counselor, and help other veterans successfully transition to civilian life. A few overprivileged college students aren't going to stop me from accomplishing that." Derek smiled for the first time since she had arrived. You know, Marcus and his group have no idea what they're up against, do they? No, Sarah said quietly. They really don't. As she drove home from the coffee shop, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: confidence. The harassment had been wearing her down because it was unpredictable and unclear. But now she understood the situation tactically. She knew who her opponents were, what they wanted, and generally how they planned to achieve it. More importantly, she understood that this was fundamentally a test of her commitment to her new mission. Just as her military service had required her to persist through difficult and dangerous situations, her civilian education was going to require similar persistence. The enemy had changed, and the battlefield had changed. But the core challenge remained the same. Could she complete her mission despite opposition from people who wanted to stop her? Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, had never failed to complete a mission. She wasn't planning to start now. That evening, she called Officer Coleman and Dr. Santos to report the new information Derek had provided. She also began developing a plan for how to handle the escalation that was almost certainly coming. She would document everything meticulously. She would follow all proper channels for reporting harassment. She would work with campus officials to ensure her safety and her rights. But she would also be prepared to defend herself and her mission if those measures proved insufficient. The Peace Coalition thought they were fighting for their vision of what a college campus should be. But they had chosen to target someone who had spent 8 years fighting for her vision of what the world should be. And in that kind of fight, Sarah Martinez had never lost. The Peace Coalition's escalation began the following Monday morning. Sarah arrived on campus to find that someone had covered her car with flyers featuring her military photo alongside images of wounded civilians. The headline read, "This woman killed for money. Why is she on our campus?" Sarah photographed everything before removing the flyers. She noticed several students watching her from a distance, some holding phones to record her reaction. She forced herself to remain calm and methodical, treating the situation like evidence collection at a crime scene. The flyers had been distributed across campus overnight. Sarah found them posted on bulletin boards, taped to building walls, and scattered across walkways. Each one contained the same message: that military veterans were dangerous killers who didn't belong in academic environments. By the time Sarah reached her first class, it was clear that the campaign had succeeded in making her the center of campus attention. Students stared as she walked by, some with curiosity, others with obvious hostility. A few offered supportive nods, but most seemed uncomfortable and uncertain. Professor Williams looked concerned as Sarah took her seat in American history class. Before beginning his lecture, he addressed the class directly. "I'm aware that there's been some controversial material circulated on campus this morning," he said carefully. "I want to remind everyone that this classroom is a space for respectful academic discussion. Personal attacks and harassment have no place in our learning environment." Derek raised his hand. "Professor, shouldn't we talk about this directly? I mean, it's obviously affecting the classroom dynamic." Professor Williams hesitated. "If the class would like to discuss the broader issues, I'm open to that. But I won't allow personal attacks on any student." A young woman Sarah didn't recognize spoke up from the front row. "Why should someone who is trained to kill people be allowed in our classes? Doesn't their presence make the learning environment unsafe?" "That's exactly the kind of statement I won't allow," Professor Williams said firmly. "Military service is a legitimate career choice, and veterans have the same rights as any other students." "But they've been conditioned to use violence," another student argued. "How do we know they won't snap under academic pressure?" Sarah felt every eye in the room turned toward her. She took a deep breath and stood up slowly. "If I may," she said quietly, "I'd like to address those concerns directly." Professor Williams nodded. "Go ahead, Sarah." Sarah walked to the front of the classroom, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes watching her every move. She had briefed generals and addressed rooms full of military personnel, but this felt different, more personal, more consequential. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice calm and clear. "I served 8 years as a Navy SEAL, including 5 combat deployments. I'm now a junior psychology major with a 3.8 GPA. I'm studying to become a licensed counselor so I can help other veterans transition to civilian life." The room was completely silent. Some of you are concerned that my military background makes me dangerous. I understand that concern, and I want to address it honestly. Sarah looked around the room, making eye contact with as many students as possible. Military training does change how you think and react. It teaches you to assess threats quickly, to make decisions under pressure, and to take action when action is necessary. Those aren't necessarily bad qualities, but they can seem intimidating in civilian contexts. A student in the middle of the room raised her hand. But have you killed people? Yes, Sarah answered without hesitation. I have killed people who were trying to kill me, my teammates, and innocent civilians. I have also saved people who would have died if I hadn't been there. The blunt honesty seemed to surprise the class. But here's what I want you to understand, Sarah continued. The same training that taught me how to use force also taught me when not to use force. Military personnel are trained in rules of engagement, laws of armed conflict, and ethical decision-making under extreme pressure. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I have never used violence against anyone who wasn't posing an immediate threat to innocent life. I have never lost my temper and hurt someone. I have never used my training to intimidate or harm people in non-combat situations. How do we know that's true? Asked the student who had raised concerns about safety. You don't, Sarah said simply. Just like I don't know whether the pre-med student sitting next to you will use their medical knowledge responsibly, or whether the business major behind me will treat their future employees ethically, or whether the education major in the corner will protect the children they teach. She looked around the room again. Every profession involves training people to use power that affects other people's lives. Doctors make life and death decisions. Teachers shape young minds. Business leaders control resources that determine whether families can afford food and housing. Police officers carry weapons and have authority to arrest people. But those professions are regulated, another student pointed out. So is military service, Sarah replied. Extensively. Military personnel are subject to civilian oversight, military law, international law, and their own professional ethics codes. We're also subject to investigation and prosecution if we violate those standards. Derek spoke up from his usual seat. Sarah, can you help us understand how you deal with the psychological impact of combat? I mean, doesn't that training create emotional problems that might affect your interactions with other students? Sarah appreciated the thoughtful way Derek had phrased his question. That's probably the most important question anyone's asked, she said. Combat does have psychological effects that last long after you come home. PTSD, anxiety, depression, difficulty with relationships. These are real issues that many veterans face. So how do we know you're not dealing with those issues? The first student asked, her tone less hostile now and more genuinely curious. You don't know that I'm not dealing with those issues, Sarah said. Because I am dealing with them. I go to therapy. I take medication when necessary. I work constantly on managing stress and processing traumatic experiences. The honesty seemed to surprise the class again. But here's the thing, Sarah continued. Acknowledging that you have a problem and working to address it is not the same as being dangerous. In fact, it's the opposite. The veterans who are most likely to have serious problems are the ones who refuse to get help, who deny that their experiences have affected them, who try to tough it out alone. She walked back toward her seat, then turned to face the class one more time. I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm a veteran. I'm asking you to judge me based on my actions, just like you would any other student. If I do something threatening or inappropriate, call campus security. If I contribute positively to class discussions, acknowledge that contribution. If I need help with an assignment, treat me the same way you treat any other classmate. What about the flyers that were distributed this morning? Asked a student near the back. How do you respond to those accusations? Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly. The flyers were designed to make me feel unwelcome and to turn other students against me. They misrepresent both my military service and my reasons for being on this campus. But they raise legitimate questions about military policy, the student pressed. They might, Sarah acknowledged. But they raise those questions by attacking me personally rather than engaging with policy issues substantively. That's not productive debate. That's harassment. Professor Williams stepped forward. I think this has been a very valuable discussion, but we should probably return to our scheduled material for today. As Sarah returned to her seat, She noticed that the atmosphere in the classroom had changed. Some students still looked uncomfortable, but the hostility had diminished. Several students nodded at her respectfully as she passed their desks. After class, Derek approached her in the hallway. "That was well handled," he said. "You answered their questions honestly without getting defensive." "Thanks. I've been thinking about how to address these concerns since our first conversation." "How are you holding up with all the harassment?" Sarah considered the question. "It's stressful, but it's also clarifying. I understand what I'm dealing with now, which makes it easier to develop a strategy." "What kind of strategy?" "The same kind I used in the military. Document everything, work with allies, stay focused on the mission, and don't let the opposition control the narrative." Derek looked curious. "Who are your allies?" "People like you who are willing to ask honest questions and listen to honest answers. Campus officials who take harassment seriously. Other veterans who understand what I'm going through. And students who believe in treating everyone fairly regardless of their background." That afternoon, Sarah received a call from Dean Patricia Morrison, the Dean of Students. Dean Morrison wanted to meet. The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah was ready for it. She had been trained to overcome overwhelming odds, to persist when others would quit, and to complete impossible missions. Finishing college and becoming a counselor suddenly seemed a lot more achievable than some of the objectives she had accomplished in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Peace Coalition had made a serious tactical error. They had tried to overwhelm someone who specialized in turning overwhelming situations to her advantage. They were about to learn why the U.S. Navy SEALs had one of the most difficult training programs in the world, and why so few people who began that training ever graduated. Sarah Martinez was a graduate, and she was just getting started. Brad nodded. "I think I understand better now." As Sarah left the coffee shop that evening, she reflected on the conversation. It had been emotionally draining, but also productive. For the first time since starting school, she felt like she was building bridges between her military experience and her civilian education. The path forward was still uncertain, but she was beginning to see how her background could be an asset rather than a liability in her new life. The questions from other students had been challenging, but they had also helped her clarify her own thoughts about her service and her goals. Tomorrow there would be other classes, other conversations, other opportunities to learn and grow. The mission was changing, but it was still a mission. And Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL, current student, future counselor, was ready to continue serving in whatever way she could. Sarah nodded. "I'm still learning how to talk about it. It's harder than I expected. If you ever want to talk more about incorporating your experiences into the curriculum, I'd be very interested," Professor Williams offered. "I'll think about it," Sarah said. As she left the classroom and walked across campus to her car, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. The confrontation with Derek had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. She was tired of hiding who she was and what she had done. If she was going to help other veterans, she needed to be honest about her own struggles and experiences. The afternoon sun was warm on her face as she walked through the parking lot. For the first time since starting school, she felt like she might actually belong here. Not as someone pretending to be a typical student, but as someone with unique experiences and perspectives that could contribute to the academic community. She had spent 8 years learning how to be a warrior. Now she was learning how to be a student, a civilian, and eventually a counselor. It was a different kind of mission, but it was still a mission. And, like every mission she had ever accepted, she was determined to complete it successfully. As she drove home to her small apartment, Sarah began thinking about her next psychology class. The professor had been discussing trauma and recovery, topics that were deeply personal for her. Maybe it was time to stop hiding in the back of that classroom too. Maybe it was time to start contributing her voice to those discussions as well. The road ahead was uncertain, but Sarah had faced uncertainty before. She had learned to adapt, to overcome obstacles, and to complete missions even when the odds were against her. Civilian life was just another mission, and she was beginning to believe that she might actually succeed at this one too.